Hello, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Stone, and today we are reading Halo Contact Harvest. We are on Chapter 7, and let's just get straight into it. Harvest, January 16th, 2525. As soon as the first platoon's recruits had bussed their breakfast trays into the mess hall's sanitizer, Avery led them on their daily march, 10 kilometers out and back along the Gladsheim Highway. After 2 weeks of physical training, they were used to the route, a devastatingly dull path through the flat fields of wheat. But until today, they had never done it with the full 25-kilogram rucksacks, and by the time Epsilon Indy was blazing in the mid-morning sky, the march had become a uniquely punishing ordeal. This was true for Avery as well, who hadn't gotten any decent exercise since before his trip back home. The long stretches of cryo sleep from Epsilon Eridanus to Sol, and then from Sol to Epsilon Indy, had left him with a condition commonly known as freezer burn. This agonizing sensation, like a bad case of pins and needles, was caused by the breakdown of cryosleep pharmaceuticals trapped in muscles and joints. In Avery's case was the worst he'd ever felt, a deep prickling pain in his knees and shoulders brought on by the strenuous march. Avery winced as he removed his ruck, but it was easy to hide his discomfort from his platoon, because the 36 men huddled around the parade ground flagpole were focused on their own exhaustion. Sweat running down his nose and chin, Avery watched as one of them vomited his jostled breakfast. This started a chain reaction that soon had almost half the platoon heaving loudly onto the gravel. Jenkins, a younger recruit with rust-colored hair, was doubled over directly in front of Avery, thin arms resting on his knees. He made a sound that was half cough, half cry. Avery saw a string of spittle stretched toward his poorly tied boots. He's going to have blisters. Avery frowned, staring at the loose laces, but he also knew Jenkins faced a more immediate and dangerous threat: dehydration. He pulled a plastic water bottle from his ruck and thrust it into the recruit's shaking hands. "Drink it slow." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Jenkins wheezed, but he didn't move. "Now, recruit," Avery barked. Jenkins straightened so quickly that the shifting weight of his ruck almost tossed him back on his bony behind. His shrunken cheeks swelled as he unscrewed the bottle and took 2 big gulps. "I said slow." Avery tried to keep his anger in check, "or you're gonna cramp." Avery knew the Colonial Militia wasn't the Marines, but it was difficult for him to lower his expectations for his recruits' performance. About half of them were members of Harvest law enforcement and other emergency services, so they were at least mentally prepared for the rigors of basic training. But these men were older as well, some of them in their late 40s or early 50s, and they weren't all in the best of shape. Things weren't much better with the younger recruits like Jenkins. Most of them had grown up on farms because Harvest Jotuns did all the hard manual labor. They were just as physically unprepared as their elders to learn the strenuous craft of soldiery. "Healy," Avery shouted, pointing to Jenkins' boots. "Got a pair of bad feet." "That makes 3, the corpsman shot back. He was handing out water bottles to a pair of paunchy, middle-aged recruits with sunburned faces. "Das and Abel are so fat, I think they wore right through their socks." The corpsman had raised his voice loud enough for the whole platoon to hear. A few of the men, who hadn't lost their breakfast, and their sense of humor along with it, chuckled quietly at Healy's inane accusation. Avery scowled. He couldn't decide what made him more upset: the fact that Healy insisted on clowning around, ruining the no-nonsense mood he was trying to set, or that the corpsman already knew every recruit's name, while Avery still had to check the name tape on the chest pockets of their olive-drab fatigue shirts. "You got the energy to talk, you got the energy to walk," Avery snapped. "Get some water, suck it down. All I want to hear is the sound of hydration, which, to be clear, sounds like absolutely nothing at all." Immediately 36 clear plastic bottles tipped skywards. Jenkins was so especially eager to keep his sore feet where they were, and guzzled his water at an alarming rate. Avery watched the recruit's oversized Adam's apple bob up and down like a yo-yo on a very short string. The kid can't even follow an order about drinking properly. The sound of voices on the garrison drive announced the return of Byrne and 2nd Platoon. Avery could hear them calling cadence, shouting a Marine Corps marching chant. Byrne bellowed each line, and his recruits repeated. God, you're gonna make me chant it. When I die, please bury me deep. Place an MA5 down by my feet. Don't cry for me, don't shed no tear. Just pack my box with PT gear. 'Cause one early morning by 05, the ground will rumble, there'll be lightning in the sky. Don't you worry, don't come undone. It's just my ghost on a PT run. I mean, to be fair, that's... Okay, I'm glad I did that. I ain't no bitch. As 2nd Platoon crested the top of the drive and shuffled into the parade ground, the screen door to Captain Ponder's quarters swung open. As usual, the captain had chosen not to wear his prosthetic. The sleeve of his fatigue shirt was once again pinned neatly to his side. "Attention!" Avery barked. Ponder gave 1st Platoon a chance to straighten up, and 2nd Platoon time to come to a gasping stop. Then he asked in a loud but friendly voice, "You men enjoy your stroll?" "Sir, yes, sir," the recruits answered with varied enthusiasm. Ponder turned to Byrne. "They don't sound too sure, Staff Sergeant." "No, they don't," Byrne snarled. "Maybe 10 clicks..." I don't know who said this. I'm going to assume it's Byrne. "Maybe 10 clicks wasn't long enough for them to make up their minds. I'd be happy to run 'em again, Captain." "Well, let me make sure." Ponder put his fist on his hip and shouted, "I say again, did you all enjoy your stroll?" All 72 recruits shouted at once, "Sir, yes, sir." "Do it again tomorrow?" "Sir, yes, sir." "Now I definitely heard that. At ease." As the recruits got back to aching, Ponder waved Avery over. That was their pace. Not bad, considering their load. "What's the plan for this afternoon?" "Thought I might take 'em out to the range." Ponder nodded his head approvingly. "About time we let them punch a few targets, but you'll need to hand them off to Byrne. We've got a date." "Sir?" "Solstice celebration. Utgard, governor of this fine planet, extended an invitation to me and one of my staff sergeants." The captain jutted his chin toward Byrne, currently unleashing a string of expletives at a terrified recruit who had just made the mistake of losing his breakfast directly on the staff sergeant's boots. "It's a formal affair. Ladies in long dresses, that sort of thing." Ponder smiled at Avery. "I have a feeling you'll be a better fit." "Roger that." The last thing Avery wanted to do was field questions about the insurrection from a bunch of boozy politicians, but as he watched Byrne order the recruit to start doing push-ups directly over his vomit-covered boots, he had to admit, the captain was probably right. And besides, there were questions Avery wanted to ask Ponder first and foremost. Why he and Byrne had been transferred to Harvest. Since the night of their fight in the barracks, the two staff sergeants hadn't exactly been on speaking terms, so Avery had gotten no information from Byrne. During the ride to Utgard, he hoped the captain could explain why the UNSC had seen fit to transfer 2 trebuchet team leaders, take them off the front line of the insurrection. Avery had a strong suspicion that he wasn't going to like Ponder's answer. "Party starts at 0630. The captain turned back to his quarters. "Clean yourself up. Meet me at the motor pool, ASAP." Avery snapped a hasty salute, then strode back to his recruits. "Forzel, Wick, Anderson, Jenkins," he boomed, reading their names from his compad. 4 sets of shoulders set a little straighter. "Says here none of you have ever handled a weapon. Is that correct?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant." Recruits replies were halting, embarrassed. Some of the older militiamen, constables who were used to carrying small caliber fires. Some of the older militiamen, constables who were used to carrying small caliber sidearms for their work. My lord. Snickered at the recruit's inexperience. Won't be so funny when they're standing behind you in a firefight, Avery growled. The constable's laughter quickly died. Avery motioned for Jenkins and the others to gather round. The captain and I have an appointment in town, so Staff Sergeant Burns is going to get you all snapped in. The recruits looked blankly at one another, confused by Avery's shorthand. He's going to teach you how to shoot, Avery clarified. Try not to shoot each other. An hour later, he was behind the wheel of a Warthog, speeding east on the Gladsheim Highway, with Captain Ponder in the passenger seat behind him. With Epsilon Indy beating down directly overhead, Avery was unusually glad of the vehicle's stripped-down design. In a war zone, the Warthog's lack of roof and doors made it a dangerous ride, but when the only enemy you faced was a sweaty cling of a navy blue dress uniform, its open-air passenger compartment was an absolute blessing. To help keep themselves cool, both men had removed their navy blue dress coats and rolled their shirt sleeves to their elbows. Ponder opted to keep his false arm covered, Avery guessed because the prosthetic's titanium joints would get uncomfortably warm in the direct sunlight. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the captain reach up and scratch his shoulder, massaging the nanofiber junction where the circuits met the man. For some time, Avery and Ponder sat in silence and watched the wheat fields around the garrison give way to vast peach and apple orchards. Avery wasn't sure how best to break the ice. He didn't just want to come out and ask, "Why am I here?" He guessed there was a good reason why the captain was keeping the information secret, and suspected it would take a little more finesse to draw his answer out. So he started with something simple. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what happened to your arm?" M-EDF 921-1, Ponder replied, raising his voice above the Warthog's roar. "You familiar with the unit?" Avery automatically parsed the code, 9th Marine Expeditionary Force, 21st Division, 1st Battalion. It was one of the many units serving in Epsilon Eridanus. "Yes, sir," hard-ass grunts. That they were. The captain reached two of his prosthetics metal fingers into his shirt pocket and retrieved a Sweet William cigar. "I used to be their CO. Avery tightened his grip on the steering wheel as a hauler blew by in the opposite direction. "What sort of action did you see?" He did his best to keep a casual tone, but if what Ponder said was true, that meant he was a critical part of the UNSC's fight against the insurrection, that his presence on Harvest was just as odd as Avery and Burns. "Let's not beat around the bush, Staff Sergeant. Trebuchet, it's in your file. Burns, too. And I've spent the last 2 weeks wondering the exact same thing." The captain bit the tip off his cigar. "Why would the Corps send 2 of its meanest sons of bitches way out here?" "I was hoping you might shed some light on that, sir." "Hell if I know." Ponder removed a silver lighter with a hinged top from his pants pocket, cracked it open, and began stroking his cigar. "Fleetcom hasn't been all that free with information," he said between puffs, then snapping the lighter shut. "Since they gave me a demotion," something clicked in Avery's head. Of course, he thought, the CO of a Marine battalion would be at least a lieutenant colonel, 2 pay grades higher than Ponder's current captain rank. But Avery had no idea what this meant with respect to the larger question. If anything, Ponder's revelation made things even more confusing. "Demotion, sir?" he asked, treading water. "I lost my arm," Ponder began, "in Elysium City, Eridanus 2. He put one of his boots up on the dash. "This was back in 13. Watts and his gang were just starting to show their teeth. Colonel Robert Watts, or that bastard to most UNSC personnel, was a Marine Corps officer born and raised in Epsilon Eridanus, who had defected to the insurrectionist side early in the war. He and the group of turncoats he commanded were one of Trebuchet's priority targets. So far, no one had gotten a decent shot at him, though Avery had once come close. "We were hoping to capture Watts' second-in-command," Ponder continued, taking a long drag on his cigar. "Admirals at Fleetcom wanted my battalion to go in strong, plenty of armor and air support, intimidate the locals into giving the guy up without a fight. But the town was still 50-50. Not everyone was on the Indies' side, and I thought a little restraint might help win some hearts and minds." Avery grunted. "Must have been before my time." "Things were different in the beginning. There was still time to talk, A chance for peace. Ponder shook his head. Anyhow, this guy, my target, had married the daughter of one of the local officials. I thought the father-in-law would be pretty ticked when a whole armored column showed up on his doorstep, but the next thing I knew, I was in his living room sipping tea. Ponder tapped the ash from his cigar. Talked about nothing for a few minutes, just got comfortable. Then, when his wife was pouring me a second cup, I got down to it. We're looking for so-so. Do you know where we can find him? We don't mean your daughter any harm, etc., etc. He looks me right in the eye. Ponder paused and stared out the Warthog's sloped windshield. He looks me in the eye and says, "Someday, we will win, no matter what it takes." The captain flexed his prosthetic arm. What the fuck is this word? Pantomiming his memories. Then he put his arm around the target's wife, his own daughter, raised it up like this. Took me a second to realize he had a grenade. Avery didn't know what to say, except that, having inherited the insurrection from men like Ponder, he'd seen things at least as surprising, at least as tragic. I knew it was a bluff. This guy was dedicated to the cause, no doubt, but kill his whole family? Wasn't going to happen. Ponder pulled the half-smoked cigar from his teeth and grounded it on the dash. One of my snipers thought different. But a hasty round through the wall of his house tore the guy in half, but he pulled the pin on reflex. The captain shrugged. I dove to cover the blast. Things got worse from there. Tight space, jumpy soldiers. Avery knew worse had meant a lot of civilian casualties. Some very angry top brass, and adding insult to injury, Ponder taking a 2-step drop in rank. I think they wanted me to take an early retirement, but I stuck with it, the captain said. Took a bunch of lousy billets and worked my way up to CMT. Thought I'd left the insurrection behind me. Shot Avery a look that was more inquisitive than accusatory. Then along came the two of you. Again, Avery was at a loss for words, but Ponder was soon lost in more memories from that terrible day long ago. For a while, both men resumed their silence. Out in the apple orchards, Avery saw Jotuns, a pair of monstrous pickers large enough to engulf whole trees with their agitating arms. He had overheard Healy arguing with one of his recruits about the exact number of Jotuns on harvest. The corpsman refused to believe there were 3 Jotuns for every person, almost 1,000,000 machines, until the recruit had explained he was counting all different versions, the smallest aerial crop dusters to the 6-wheeled beasts like the ones in the orchard. It's funny, Ponder said in a way that made clear he didn't think it was the least bit so. But at first I missed it. My men, the combat, all of it. It took me years to realize how crazy that was, that I'd been damn lucky to get out when I did, before things really got bad. And I made a mistake that got a lot more people killed. Avery nodded his head, although he might as well have said, I know exactly what you mean. By now the Bifrost had begun to rise before them. They were still an hour away from the limestone escarpment, but squinting his eyes, Avery could just see the dark switchbacks carving back and forth across its face that would take them up to Utgard. Oh, sorry. Oh my god. On either side of the switchback, separated by hundreds of kilometers, there were 2 maglev train lines. Thick monorails that angled down from the top of the Bifrost to meet the Ida, far out in the orchards. Avery saw a long train of cargo containers glide down the southern line. The train seemed to move too quickly for the container's size, and Avery realized they must be empty. On their way to a depot were hundreds of Jotuns waited with fresh-picked loads. Maybe Fleetcom decided you needed a break? Ponder offered. Maybe, Avery said. It was as good an explanation as any. Well, why not start tonight? Have a drink. Dance with a girl. Avery smiled despite himself. That an order, sir? Ponder laughed and slapped his artificial arm on his thigh. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Yes, it is. By the time Avery pulled the Warthog into the curved drive of Harvest Parliament Building, he knew a lot more about Captain Ponder. how fighting the insurrection had forced him to miss his eldest son's wedding and the birth of his first grandchild. Precious occasions he'd missed much more than his arm. As they dismounted, buttoned their coats, brass buttons, and pulled on their black-billed dress caps, Avery realized he not only trusted, but had a great deal more respect for the man who wore his CO's uniform. The Parliament's lobby was thick with partygoers, men in pastel, seersucker suits, women in ruffled, scoop-neck gowns, fashions that were already out of style in core world salons, but had only just taken hold of Harvest's provincial high society. Some of the guests gawked and whispered as Avery and Ponder passed, and it struck the staff sergeant that they were the first Marines, the first soldiers some of the guests had ever seen. But as they treaded their way up a crowded granite staircase to the ballroom, some of the curious gazes turned cold. We might be a new sight, Avery grimaced, but not necessarily a welcome one. It seemed the UNSC's handling of the insurrection wasn't any more popular on Harvest than it was anywhere else. Nils Thune, someone bellowed from the landing at the top of the staircase. A thick hand shot out from a great swath of red and white striped fabric. You must be Captain Ponder. Governor. Ponder paused on the top step and saluted. Then he extended his hand. It's an honor to meet you. Likewise, of course. Thune's grip was so strong he practically pulled Ponder up onto the landing. May I introduce you to one of my men, Staff Sergeant Avery Johnson. Thune released Ponder's hand and offered it to Avery. Well, Johnson? Thune's red beard parted in a broad, toothsome grin. What do you think of our planet? Avery had a strong grip, but Thune's was immobilizing. His hand possessed the kind of strength one got from years of farming the old-fashioned way, without assistance from a fleet of hulking automatons. Avery guessed correctly that despite his vigor, the governor was well into his 60s, that he'd been one of the first colonists to land on Harvest. Reminds me of home, sir, Avery grimaced. I grew up on Earth, Chicago, industrial zone. Thune released Avery's hand and stabbed his thumb happily to his chest. Minnesota! Oh my God! Minnesota! Joe Biden. Oh, soda! Oh, God. Damn, that was good. My mother's and father's side both, far back as I can remember. Widening his smile, he ushered the Marines toward the doorway of a brightly lit ballroom. You're in good company, Staff Sergeant. Most everyone around here's from the Midwest. Pulled up stakes when the soil went bad. Of course, none of us knew just how much better things would be once we got to Harvest. Jeez. The governor snatched a champagne flute from a passing waiter and downed it in one gulp. This way! He shuffled sideways through the ballroom door, his girth doing at least as much to part the crowd as any deference to his office. And stay close. The show's about to start, and I want you two front and center. Avery shot Ponder a confused look, but the captain simply plunged into Thune's gap. Avery followed just as the crowd drew back upon itself, practically sucking him into the ballroom. Doing their best not to step on any toes, the Marines followed Thune to one of the many glass-paned doors in the ballroom's eastern wall that led to a broad balcony overlooking the Parliament's gardens, and beyond that, Utgard's Mall. Stepping up beside Thune against the balcony's waist-high granite railing, Avery saw the park was full of revelers. Light globes tugging at their tethers in the twilight breeze illuminated knots of families sitting on brightly colored picnic blankets. Hardly any of the mall was left uncovered, and Avery was certain the vast majority of the planet's 300,000 residents were in attendance. But for what? He still wasn't quite sure. Roll! Thune's shout rang painfully loud in Avery's ears. Over here! The governor waved a hand above his head, but this wasn't necessary. Thune was taller than anyone on the balcony, Avery included, and the mop of thick, red and gray hair that covered his head was impossible to miss. Avery craned his neck toward the ballroom in time to see the governor's semi-typical opposite slide out from the jostling crowd, a short, balding man whose elderly frame barely filled his light gray linen suit. Roll Peterson, Thune announced. My attorney general. Just a fancy way to say lawyer. Peterson smiled modestly through his chin, pursed lips. Through his thin, pursed lips. Jesus Christ. He didn't offer Avery or Ponder his hand, but not for any lack of courtesy. The jubilant crowd had begun to flow from the ballroom to the railing, crushing the attorney general's arms firmly to his sides. Roll's about as formal as we get out here, Thune explained. Stickler for details. He's the one who handled all the negotiations with CA about us raising a militia. Technically, Peter's eyes twinkled as he raised one of his white eyebrows, I formally accepted their demand that we have one. Just then, the sky erupted with fireworks, filling the gaps filling the gaps between the Tiara's 7 elevators with multicolored blossoms. Jutting up from Utgard's skyline, the strands shone bronze in Epsilon Indy's failing light. As the showering sparks rippled the air around them, they appeared to vibrate, like plucked strings in a giant's harp. All right, everyone, Thune roared as the last of the fireworks erupted in a smoky blue-green cloud. Get set. The governor put his hands to his ears, as did everyone else on the balcony except Avery and Ponder. Mass driver, Peterson explained. We fire at every solstice. All at once, the towers around the mall went dark as the city's electrical grid lost power. There was a bright flash beyond the Tiara's central number 4 strand, and a moment later, a shockwave hammered the mall, flattening the light globes and sending the picnickers squealing after flying napkins and bowled-over children. On the balcony, women shrieked in gleeful fright as they clutched their billowing dresses. Men made a gallant show of uncapping their ears as a sonic boom pealed past the Parliament. Hurrah! Thune shouted, starting a round of applause that echoed a similar outburst from the picnickers on the mall. Well done, Mac. That's mighty kind, Governor. The AI replied from Thune's compad, hidden somewhere in his vast jacket. I aim to please. Speaking of which, Thune said, heading away from the railing, how close did you come? Peterson freed a hand and pointed after Thune, letting the 2 Marines know they were expected to follow. This time the governor led them to the far end of the ballroom, where a group of girls with satin bows on their dresses and boys in shiny vests and shoes, packed tight around a circular table topped with a cornucopia of fruits and vegetables. The silver hollow projector was centered in a wreath of leafy vines and deep purple grape clusters. On top of that stood Mac. Missed by a mile, AI said, rubbing the back of its neck with a grimy handkerchief. Actually, more than 50 kilometers. But I'm sure she'll say something. No doubt, Thune chuckled. Listen, I'd like you to meet Captain Ponder and Staff Sergeant Johnson, UNSC Marines, here to raise a militia. Mac, Agricultural Operations. Mac touched the brim of his cowboy hat, and nodding toward the balcony and the masked driver somewhere beyond. Same as the Navy's big guns, just a little less kick. You know, Ponder deadpanned, there's a reason we only fire those in space. Mass drivers were a relatively simple, cheap solution for boosting objects from a planet's surface into orbit. Typically built on large, flexible gimbals, their linked magnetic loops could be charged, aimed, and fired with very little automation. With a simple computer rather than an AI, but drivers had one major disadvantage: limited throw weight, which meant that while Harvest Driver worked well during the first decade after the colony's founding, when its primary role was to send carefully packaged nuclear waste on a collision course with Epsilon Indy, for the planet to meet its full export potential, it needed to be replaced with a high-capacity lift system such as the Tiara. Driver technology was alive and well in the Navy, however in the form of mass accelerator cannon. So-called MAC frigates and cruisers were basically movable mass drivers, ships designed around the weapon's long electromagnetic coils. The technology was similar to that of the M99's stanchion rifle, but whereas the M99's light semi-ferrous rounds were only a few millimeters long, a MAC slug was more than 10 meters end-to-end, weighed 160 metric tons, and packed enough punch to penetrate the Navy's thickest titanium A armor plate. Space? Thune grumbled dismissively. Those things even make noise in zero-G? If you're inside a Mac ship when the cannon fires, Ponder raised his hands wide around his head, simulating a deafening boom. I don't know if you're a religious man, Governor, but it's a little like a church bell. Am I? The governor beamed. Lutheran, born and raised. Peterson sighed in mock protest. If I had known you were going to bring up religion, Captain, as Attorney General, I would have counseled a less contentious topic. And I was about to tell a story, Mac added, loud enough for all the children to hear. The young crowd cheered as a holographic representation of a bustling Wild West Main Street appeared behind Mac. A group of masked outlaws rushed from a bank, firing their six-shooters and spooking the horses of a passing stagecoach. The children oohed and awed. Mac pulled a sheriff's star out of his hip pocket and pinned it to his chest. Might want to take the sermon to the saloon. Fine by me, Thune said, clapping Ponder on the shoulder. Captain? Ponder stood firm under the force of Thune's blow. After you, Governor, before he followed Thune to the ballroom's bar. He asked Peterson, I gave my staff sergeant strict orders to find himself a dance partner. Know anyone who might fit the bill? Peterson raised an eager finger. I have just the one. I certainly appreciate it, Ponder said. Then to Avery with a smile, good luck, Marine. Before Avery could respond, the captain turned on his heels, and Avery felt Peterson's light touch on his elbow. Do you know about the driver incident? The Attorney General asked, leading Avery away from the first shots of Mac's gunfight and the delighted squeals of children. Incident, sir? The thing between Mac and Sif? No. Well. Peterson proceeded to explain how, not long after the DCS installed Sif in the Tiara, there had been a critical failure in her data center's power supply. This forced her technicians to stop all activity on her strand, or risk a load imbalance that would have collapsed the entire system. It had been a serious crisis, and Mac decided to solve it by using the driver to boost a new power supply into orbit. Trying to be as helpful as possible, he shot the component right into the Tiara's number 4 coupling station. It was an incredible accomplishment. But when Sif's technicians restored her power, and she learned what Mac had done, how he could have easily obliterated her data center, Sif had not been amused. That's why she isn't here tonight, Peterson concluded as they stepped out of the ballroom and headed for the balcony's calm northeast corner. Why she always comes up with a polite excuse not to attend any celebration that involves a driver's shot. It's too bad, really. I think she could use a bit of fun. That's quite an indictment, Your Honor. A woman's voice... that's her voice now. A woman's voice rang out from the railing, bringing Peterson to a hasty stop. But Avery had already noticed the woman many paces back, seeing how her diaphanous silver shawl covered only part of her bare back. He slowed his pace to give himself time to remove his dress cap and smoothed his burr of hair. My apologies, Miss Alsigny, the Attorney General replied. But I was talking about Sif, the incident with the driver. Of course, Jalon pushed away from the railing and turned to face the Attorney General. If I remember correctly, my department mandated that you shut the driver down. As I recall, we rejected that mandate on the grounds that it was in breach of the CA Charter, a serious infringement on our already limited sovereignty. The Attorney General winked, but off the record, how could we possibly have given up such spectacular entertainment? Jalon laughed. I won't argue with that. I'm sorry, Peterson said hastily. Staff Sergeant Avery Johnson, Representative Jalon Alsigny, DCS. Jalon offered her hand. Avery hesitated. If she had been wearing a bland DCS uniform, he would have known what to do, take her hand and shake it. But her floor-length silver gown tripped him up. With its empire waist and halter top, she was the very picture of core world vogue. Her black hair was slicked back close to her scalp and tucked behind her ears, and stayed perfectly still even as a fresh breeze from the mall caught her shawl and rustled it from her soft brown shoulders. Kissing is for politicians, Jalon said, catching her shawl on her elbows, and I'm certainly not that. So Avery shook. Her grip wasn't as strong as the governor's, but not as delicate as her slender arms suggested. If you'll excuse me, Peterson coughed and patted his chest. I need to rescue this Marine's commanding officer from a riveting discussion on the trajectory of his immortal soul. Jalon smiled. Do give my best to the governor. Peterson brought his heels together and turned back to the ballroom. Jalon waited for him to disappear into the crowd until she and Avery were alone before she spoke. I'd tell you to relax, but you don't seem the type. Avery didn't know how to respond to that, but he was given a moment's reprieve thanks to a dancing couple that bumped him in the back, then spun away, giggling apologetically. The string quartet had begun a livelier second set. Those guests who hadn't gone indoors to freshen their drinks after the fireworks were now abandoning their idle conversations for the more alluring language of waltz. Jalon retrieved a small clamshell purse dangling from one of her wrists. It was covered with tiny mirrors shaped like fish scales that dazzled Avery's gaze. 48789-20114-AJ, she said, pulling a compad from the purse and reading from its screen. That is your serial number, correct? Avery's eyes refocused. Yes, ma'am. Suddenly her smile didn't seem so sweet. Team leader, Orion Detachment, NavSpec War Division. With respect, ma'am. That's classified. I know. Avery felt moisture starting to pool under his arms. How can I help you, ma'am? Innies are attacking freighters, destroying cargo, killing crew. I need you to stop them. I'm a drill instructor, Colonial Militia. Find someone else. Jalon drew her shawl back onto her shoulders. You were AWOL in Chicago, she said matter-of-factly, and under investigation for possible gross misconduct. Avery clenched his jaw. I was cleared of, given your status, didn't you think it was odd that FleetCom would approve your request for transfer? Avery narrowed his eyes in an intimidating stare. I'll tell you what's odd. Someone from DCS with access to my file. You talking to me like you're my CEO. Jalon raised her compad and turned it so Avery could see her ID picture glowing on its screen. In her official UNSC uniform. Avery thought she looked as beautiful as she did in her gown, but only in the way he considered a well-maintained weapon beautiful, clean, locked tight, and ready to inflict deadly force. A text stamp below her picture clarified her true rank and departmental affiliation. Lieutenant Commander, ONI Section 3. As of now, I am your commanding officer. Jalon shut off her pad. You can check your attitude, Staff Sergeant, and start following orders, or I will arrange for your immediate transfer back to Trebuchet. There was no anger in her voice, calm determination. Do I make myself clear? Avery choked on a slowly building rage. At last, he knew exactly why he had come to Harvest, as well as who had brought him here. Yes, ma'am. Alsigny dropped her comm into her purse and snapped it shut. Wait for me downstairs. As soon as I can collect Staff Sergeant Byrne, we'll be shipping out. Dress rippling behind her, she stepped quickly into the waltzing crowd. Chapter 8. Wow. Chapter 7 was a big one. Look, my lord, look at that. Look how much the book. God. Oh, son. Alright. That was a good one. I really like this book, to be honest. It's long ass chapters, but it makes it so it's almost like a 2-in-1 video, kind of. It's a lot of reading, but it's a good book. It really captures you. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.